welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Eck, your host. Our guest is Magnus McFarland Barrow. He's in charge of Mary's Meals Ministry and an author of a new book, The Shed That Fed a Million Children, available in bookstores everywhere. Welcome to EWTN's Bookmark. Great to have you back here on EWTN. You do some fabulous work, and now you've been able to commit some of that to book format. But I figured it would be good to talk a little bit about your ministry and how media plays into supporting the work you're doing. Now, from your accent, I can gather that you're not from the United States.
No, I'm from the Highlands of Scotland. Grew up in a small village in the middle of nowhere, where I still live, in fact.
Well, speaking of that village and nowhere, one of the things that struck me too was you've got a hyphenated last name. Now, usually when you hear that, you're dealing with a woman who maybe had her original, her and then her married name. Is it typical to have hyphenated names in Scotland?
No, not very typical.
Okay.
It was my grandfather who took that name. I never met him. He died when my father was 9. But he caused a bit of a scandal in Scotland by becoming Catholic. He was an Episcopalian minister, and he ended up taking that name. It was his mother's name and his father's name. Okay,
so that was kind of, he realized he might have been doing the right thing, but he was going to cause some issues for his family.
Yeah, I always wondered why my grandfather made that decision, and always looked forward to meeting him in heaven. But a couple of years ago, a Catholic newspaper in Scotland were going through their archives, and they found this article that my grandfather had written about why he made that decision. And it was beautiful to read it. It was all about the Eucharist and the fact that he always believed in the real presence. And this quite painful journey, because he realized the suffering he was going to cause his family by making that decision. And it ended beautifully, because at the very end of the article he says, I know by making this decision I'm going to cause my family hardship, but I also know that I'm bequeathing them a legacy that the richest man in the world couldn't leave his children.
We have some sense that maybe Catholicism, as it today, Christianity in general seems to be under attack. But for years, the idea that somebody would go from one religion to another was not a big deal. Now in Scotland, we watched the Mel Gibson's movies and some of the things, and Mary of Scotland and Queen of Scots, and there's a Catholic undertone to all of those things. But what percentage is Catholicism in Scotland today?
Today, about 15% of Scotland would be Catholic. Most of them would be descendants of Irish immigrants. Okay. The Catholic Church in Scotland was almost eradicated after the Reformation. There was a few small pockets in the Highlands where people were practicing their faith in secret. There was some secret seminaries there, but aside from that, the church was gone. Really.
So did they have like priest holes up there, similar to what they had in London?
Yeah, up in the glens where my father grew up, you can still see the Mass rocks, where you can see these carvings of a chalice in the rock that signified that's where they celebrated Mass, and they would have lookouts to see if anyone was coming. So an amazing history there in those pockets. But the church, its structure only came back in with the huge wave of Irish immigration.
Now, we wouldn't be talking to you if you were still a salmon farmer. How did you go from being a salmon farmer to being somebody who was one of CNN's heroes of 2010?
Well, in 1992, my brother and I watched this news bulletin about how people were suffering in Bosnia during the war. It was at its height at that point. And we just thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could just do one small thing to help the people there? We were probably moved when we'd been younger.
So you were familiar with the area.
So we knew the area, right. and so we felt moved.
And you already had a devotion to Our Lady to begin with.
Absolutely, so we just did this small thing. We launched a little appeal locally, asking people to give us food and clothing. We drove that over there. I took 1 week's holiday from my job on the fish farm to do that. Came back home thinking I'd done my good deed. To find that God had a completely different plan, because all these things we asked for continued to pour into our home.
So when you actually came back thinking, my job is finished, this shed, and that's the shed that fed a million children, and let's talk about the shed, had more stuff in it, right?
Well, that's right.
Like the loaves and the fishes.
It was very like that.
Yeah.
I'd asked I'd asked my father if I could borrow his shed, maybe for a week or two. He's never had it back 20 years later. So we were storing these items.
I think we have
that
a
were
picture of it,
donated.
because I think there's a picture of it in the book, or
There is,
right.
that's right. So it's become the global HQ of Mary's Meals as it grows around the world. So faced with this kind of outpouring of generosity, I prayed about it and I thought about it, and I decided to give up my job on the fish farm and sold my house, and somebody gave me a truck, and I just began driving that back and forth to Bosnia, not with any grand life plan.
So when, I know geography, so obviously you can't drive from, do you take a ferry? What do you do? Drive down to the coast and then take a ferry over to Europe and then drive the rest of the way? Is that
exactly?
How long does that take?
So the ferry across the English Channel, in all to get there and back was normally about 8 days, so quite a trek. And that first year of that work, I was really just doing that continuously. But it was a very blessed year for me in many ways. I met my wife that year as well.
Where did you meet her in Scotland?
Well, she's a nurse from Scotland. She heard about what we were doing in Bosnia, and she felt called to go and help the people there. So she gave up her job, asked me if I could introduce her to hospitals and doctors in Bosnia. And they said, well, actually, what we desperately need is medical supplies. So she teamed up with me. Turned out she was a far better truck driver than I am.
Really? Okay.
She passed her test first time when we had to go and sit the test for the big articulated trucks. So she began driving back and forth as well. And that's how we met. And that's been a huge blessing in my life, because while today we've got a young family that
how many kids do you have?
We have 7
Right,
children
right.
today, so 17 years old down to 3. So Julie is more at home looking after the children, but she's as passionate about this mission as I am, and that's a wonderful blessing.
Well, I would think, first of all, being a mother, there's no harder job or maybe a more important job, because charity begins at home.
Yes.
And it starts with the family, and also the fact is that I'm sure her encouragement and her willingness to let you go and work on these things when there's many times I'm sure she could use your help, right?
Absolutely. She's an amazing person, and without that support, yes, I wouldn't be doing any of this.
Now, there's something called Mary's Meals, which we're familiar with. What is the Scottish International Relief?
Well, Scottish International Relief was the first name that we took when this work became ongoing after that trip to Bosnia, and for the first 10 years of our existence, that's the name that we used. And during those 10 years, we were doing all kinds of different works across the world. No particular theme or focus. Really going where we were invited, very often by missionary priests that we knew.
And how would they hear about it? Would it just be word of mouth? I mean, this starts happening, you start showing up. When does it start to be that people realize that you really can deliver rather than it's your one-off?
Quite a lot of it was word of mouth. My mother and father run a Catholic retreat centre in Scotland, so we...
Now, did they actually convert their house or their farm or whatever to that?
Yes, I grew up in what was an old kind of hunting, fishing lodge, which...
You were a deer stalker, right?
Yeah, well, my father was a deer stalker, and I did a lot of deer stalking growing up too, and most people who came to stay in their guest house, it was for the hunting and the fishing. And then they felt that God wanted them to turn it into this retreat centre, which it still is today. It's called Craig Lodge House of Prayer, and people from all over the world come there. So we had a network. We knew a lot of people in different parts of the church all over the world, and that was kind of key to why we were being invited to help in so many places.
And is it usually directly related to the church, or do you deal with all different groups?
Well, we're open to helping people regardless of their faith or their denomination, and we'll work with any groups who can do that effectively. A very important part of the way we work is having good local partner organisations that really understand what's happening in those communities. Most often that is the church, maybe missionaries or local church. The diocese can very often be our partner too.
Now, was Fergus your brother then?
Yes.
He's the one who started. Is he still working with the ministry?
No, he had the good sense to go back to his day job on the salmon farm after that. But all my family, all my brothers, sisters, mum, dad, they're all very involved as volunteers.
Right, okay. Now, one of the things too that struck me was the fact that what you do, in the sense of it's not just the idea of giving food or showing up with food, but it's the idea of establishing like a kitchen, right? At many of these places, and setting up a kitchen. I know, was it in Malawi? you talk about that whole idea of setting up a kitchen at a school. So you bring those facilities. In a sense, you're teaching people how to fish in a lot of ways, rather than just sending stuff, because people say, well, you send it and everybody's in the news, and then the news goes away, and then someplace else turns out you go from Biafra to this place, or there's another cyclone in Burma, or a hurricane, and then you got to go there. But in a sense, the sustainability, the idea of giving people the wherewithal to continue on, right?
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the beautiful things about Mary's Meals, is that it's a very simple thing, but it does two things at once. It meets immediate needs of hungry children, but at the same time it tackles the underlying causes of poverty and gives people the means to escape poverty and dependence on aid. And this work of Mary's Meals that grew out of Scottish International Relief was born in 2002. That was a terrible year of famine in Malawi, and we were there doing emergency feeding. And during the course of that, I met this family living in a village there.
Right, you tell that story in the book.
Yes,
right.
Yes, and so the local parish priest took me to visit this family, and the father of the family had died sometime before, and the mother was dying, and she had her 6 children all around her. And I began talking to her oldest child, and he was called Edward. He was about 14, and I said at one point, Edward, what are your hopes? What's your ambition in life? And he looked at me and said, I would like to have enough food to eat, and I would like to be able to go to school one day. And that was it. That was the extent of his ambition.
The things that so many
14.
of us, obviously growing up where you did, let alone us, take for granted.
Absolutely. And that was something that we'd come across again and again working in the very poorest communities. We kept on meeting children who weren't in school because of poverty. And that's how Mary's Meals was born, that realization that we could intervene in that cycle of poverty with a very simple thing, which was about providing one good meal every day in a place of education to meet the immediate need for food, but to do it in a way that draws children into school.
Right, so Mary's Meals provides kitchen, cooking equipment, training, ongoing support, and of course some regular supplies of nutritious food that people can cook with. What are the other things that it seems like that recommends what the work you're doing, not only obviously having Our Lady's name in there, helps, and also the fact that I'm sure that people see so much of this coming out of one's faith perspective, and not just the fact I'm not a social worker, I'm not just here to help people, I'm here because I feel called by the Lord to do this kind of work, and they see that in the work that gets done through your organization. But also, and this is, in the United States we say, well, Scottish people are very thrifty. That's what we understand. They're very thrifty. But in this case, it's quite good because of the fact that you're very thrifty in the sense of, 93% of everything you get, right?
Yes, absolutely. I think you're being kind saying thrifty. Most people around the world just say Scottish people are mean.
Cheap, they would say.
But I agree. I think in this case it is good that we have that mindset. It's really important for us. Because when people give us donations, they do that so that we can feed hungry children, not so that we can build fancy offices or pay ourselves high salaries or whatever it might be. And that's one of the reasons why I've decided to stay in my little shed in the Highlands of Scotland, because it symbolises that. And yes, we adopted this policy where at least 93% of what people give us will be spent directly on the projects. And the reality is we've always done much better than that. And part of it is our thriftiness, our meanness. But it's only possible because this work is just done by this massive army of volunteers. Thousands of people all over the world giving their time on an unpaid basis. That's why we can do it.
We always hear so much about how selfish we are in society in general. Are you surprised at the fact that there's so many people willing to volunteer their time?
Well, it did surprise me in the early days of this, just people's goodness in general, and I described that a bit in the book. There's some encounters I had with extraordinarily generous people, and that in some ways has been the story of our work over and over again. And I like to think of Mary's Meals as just a series of lots and lots of little acts of love. And I see it time and time again all over the world. especially I see it with young people. And it does sadden me sometimes to hear people talk negatively about the younger generations. My experience over and over again going into schools all over the world is these young people who are hungry for justice, young people who won't accept the idea that children in other parts of the world don't have enough to eat. And they very often lead our fundraising efforts, they lead our efforts to raise awareness of this mission.
Well, do you think they just need to be challenged more? I think sometimes we've gotten into this world where, well, they don't really want to, nobody wants to bother anybody, we're all so busy, that we really need to challenge people to step up, right?
I think so. I think they need to be challenged. I think they're also looking for something that works, that convinces them this will make a difference, because there's that cynicism, isn't there, or that feeling of being overwhelmed when you look at something like global hunger. It's very easy to think, well, we can't really do anything about that. And then this message of Mary's Meals lands in front of them, and they realize, well, actually, I personally can do something about this.
And again, it seems to be some of the younger people are not like the World War II generation who would send money to a particular organization and say, oh, I'm sure it's fine. They want to be much more involved, hands-on, to see, like you said, how is this being used? How is it helping? How involved can I be in really seeing what's going on or even participating, right?
Yeah, that's very true. And I think in this age of information that's available to all, I mean, I think it surprises me sometimes how well informed and how sophisticated young people are in their thinking around those things. So when you're talking to young people today, you need to know your stuff. But that's great.
Well, they can do research and see what's going on. Now, how many different countries are you in? At one time, it was 16. Where are you now? Is that around where you are
now?
Well,
we're actually providing the meals in 12 countries right now, mainly in Africa. By far the biggest would be Malawi. So in Malawi, just to give you an idea, we feed over 25% of the children there of primary school age in
the whole country,
in that nation. So it's having a huge impact there. We would be in other countries like Liberia in West Africa, South Sudan, Kenya. But then we would also be out with Africa. We'd be in Haiti, would be one of our biggest projects, India also.
Well, what about, you mentioned the South Sudan where, there's been a lot of violence and things in different parts of the Sudan. Have you been in situations, obviously even when you first went to Bosnia, with Kosovo and stuff like that, were you dealing at all with, at those times, with armed conflicts at the same time that might have put people at risk? Or?
Yeah, I mean, we feel part of our mission is to seek out the places of greatest need, the darkest places, and sometimes that will be places of war, places of violence and unrest. Normally the reason we can do that effectively is, again, because of the church that stays there through thick and thin, and I see that as hugely different than even very good aid organizations or NGOs. Their personnel tend to come and go, and the church stays there, and the church is the community. It's embedded in the local community, and I think that's why. And
there's a level of trust, I would think, maybe, because like you said, they're there, they know the people, and they're not going to leave.
Absolutely, exactly. So I would say one of the great privileges in my life, one of the reasons I feel so blessed doing this work, is spending time with some remarkable people in the church in some very difficult situations.
Right. One of the projects that struck my eye here was something called the Backpack Appeal. What is the Backpack Appeal?
Well, when we started serving the meals, many children started coming to school for the first time. So we see this huge increase in children enrolled in school just because they know they're going to be fed, and that's one of the main objectives. But we noticed when those new children started coming into the classroom that many of them didn't even have a pencil or a pen to begin learning with. So we launched this appeal again to school children in Europe, saying, would you fill a backpack or a school bag with these basic educational items, and then we ship them to the children. I love that project. I think we've sent over 400,000 of those over now. It's a wonderful way for children, again, to understand that they personally can do something very concrete. There's that directness about that project that they love, and it's very educational. Teachers love it too.
Right.
But it's also just incredible to see those bags arriving at the other end and being received by children who normally would never have received a birthday present or a Christmas present in their whole life, and suddenly they get this bag full of beautiful gifts from somewhere far away, and it's overwhelming to them sometimes. The emotion, in those classrooms when we hand them out is something amazing.
Well, it's good because it gives younger people a chance to think about the other out there, and at the same time maybe to realize how lucky they are in the fact that somebody would be so happy to get my secondhand stuff.
Yes,
I mean, those kind of things.
Exactly.
And you even had a St. Angela's Primary School in Glasgow wrote a song.
Yeah, there's a lot of songs about Mary's Meals. Both in places like Scotland, but also in Malawi. I was there just last week again. And there's a school there, Jacaranda School for Orphans, and they have this most beautiful ministry of music ministry, and some very talented young singers. And they've written these songs. One of them would be called One Cup of Porridge. That's what we serve there. Another one, Children of Africa. They're all about Mary's Meals and how these meals are changing their lives, and I shed a tear every time I hear those kids singing those songs. It's very beautiful.
So what prompted you to end up writing a book, The Shed That Fed a Million Children, the extraordinary story of Mary's Meals, that just came out in 2015, just came out this year? What made you decide to do it? Did somebody say, we've got to promote Mary's Meals, you got a great story? Did you think of it? How did it come about?
It was a few reasons. I mean, people had been saying to me for some time, you should write this as a book. And at first I was a little bit resistant to that. I suppose more and more I notice when I tell the people the story of Mary's Meals, I notice how much joy it causes. It is an amazing story. It's a story I never could have made up. It's a story of miracles. I love the fact that Cardinal Dolan wrote about this book when he read it, that this is a modern day miracle of the loaves and the fishes.
Really.
And
right.
that really made me happy when he said those words, because that's how I feel about it. So I suppose that would be the number one reason I wrote the book, to give glory to God, because it is His work. And in a particular way, our Blessed Mother's looking after this. So I wanted to tell that story, to give glory to God, but also to protect this work as it grows so rapidly around the world, because we need to be careful that it doesn't just become about the numbers. We're feeding some incredible numbers of children.
Here it's over
today.
What, a million
it's now
now?
Over 1 million children every day of the year that we're feeding. It's mind-boggling to think over 1 million children will eat Mary's Meals today as we're sitting here. But we need to be careful we don't get carried away with the numbers. It's not about the numbers. I always remember Mother Teresa's words saying, intense love doesn't measure, it just gives.
Right.
And so one of the reasons I wrote this book was to protect our values, to ensure that people that get involved in this mission around the world don't forget that this is a work of love. It's about people. It's not just about the numbers. And then I suppose also I wrote the book in the hope that new people might read this book who haven't heard of our mission before, and it might encourage them to get involved.
Well, what's really important, and very much like EWTN, and even has been used against you a little bit, was that you rely on donations basically from people, and you're not sitting around with, you don't have these giant assets and things like that. You're really relying on people giving you money to keep the work going. And I know Mother always thought of the idea of feeling we have to rely on God's providence.
Yes.
When you stop relying on that, you start relying on your own providence, and that's never a good thing. So it struck me in looking at the book and reading the book that it was very, very similar in that way.
Absolutely, Doug. That's really, again, really important to me. That would be one of the things I'm trying to protect. So, for example, we're always very reluctant to set targets. We need to plan. But I don't like to say we will feed X number of children, or we'll raise a certain number of money by such and such a year, because we want to leave space for the Holy Spirit. And we don't want to forget that everything we have comes from our good and loving Father. So, and all the most amazing things that have happened for Mary's Meals along the way, and there's lots of them.
Right.
None of them have really been planned by us.
Never.
You know,
Right.
so
Right.
we need to be careful that we don't start kidding ourselves. We're in charge of everything.
Right, getting out in front of God or taking credit for
Yeah.
the Holy Spirit's ideas.
Exactly.
And things. And what's great too, it reminds me of EWTN in a sense. Here we are on the buckle of the Bible Belt, who would think the largest Catholic network in the world that's, hopefully to spread the catechism and teaching and supporting people in their everyday lives, comes out of Birmingham, Alabama, of all places, let alone Mary's Meals is reaching out of, the north of Scotland
Yes.
To the world,
I know, it's interesting. God seems to like choosing unexpected people and places to do his work.
Just like the apparitions so many times are to children.
Yes.
And it's always in unusual places, it seems to be. Our Lord and Our Lady like to work that way.
That's right.
Well, thank you so much for...
Thank
it's a
you,
pleasure
Doug.
meeting you.
No, it's been a pleasure
Great
meeting
work,
you
great
too.
work.
Thank you.
Magnus McFarland Barrow, author of The Shed That Fed a Million Children, and The Extraordinary Story of Mary's Meals. And of course, Mary's Meals itself is extraordinary. You can check out their website and look for this book in bookstores everywhere. I'm Doug Keck. Join us next time right here on EWTN's Bookmark.